Thank you, and just to say, I'm here speaking as the deputy of Gatwick Area Conservation Campaign, which alongside CAGNY brings together groups around the airport campaigning against the expansion. Different tactics, but I think it's good that we have two groups with very different tactics because that maximises the chances of success. So what I thought it'd be useful to do is maybe just give a quick slideshow whizzing through some of the scale of the impacts of Gatwick, which hopefully contrasts with what Sally's done very much around the campaigning side of things. It's far more than making better use of an existing runway. What they want to do is move a runway by 12 metres sideways, so it's in a different place. They want to build expansions to the terminals, 3 new hotels, there's masses more car parking, most of which they've got approval for already. So it feels like they just want unconstrained car parking, which isn't the way to get the modal shift from highways to rail, which they promised. Motorway widening. So if you drive down there and you know the north and the south terminal roundabouts, the south terminal roundabout will be a grade separated interchange. That's the scale of the increase of surface transport movements they're looking at. They haven't really looked at flight paths or night flights because that's done in separate consultations. So it's very much a cloak and dagger affair. They've hidden what many people would consider some of the major issues to local people and put it in a different place. Main construction, they say, is from 2024 to 29, ... continuing to 2038. Well, my maths is that's not 5 years, it's best part of 15-year construction process. So it's an absolutely massive project that will have impacts during the construction as well as in the long term. They say we need it. There's no demonstrated need for this. And frankly, there's no demonstrated need for the overall increase of night flights, which they could get by just intensifying the use of the existing runway while saying no new night flights on the one next door. Employment, they say it's going to benefit by creating lots of jobs. What they don't tell you is that for the last 20 years, automation has happened within the airport industries. There's been a 2% loss of employment every year. So what this would do is keep the employment levels at Gatwick at the end of their period the same as it is today. So what that cries out is that if you want more jobs, you're not going to get it from Gatwick. So all they're doing is automating and reducing the skill level, reducing the pay level for people who work on the airport. So if you want a different future for the next generation locally, you can't look to the airport for those jobs. And an economic benefit, for example, the flights that bring overseas passengers to the UK, they count the economic benefit. The flights that take UK residents out of the UK to go on holiday, which is far more from Gatwick, they say, I'm not sure about that. So that they very much choose what they want to include and what they want to exclude. And the net tourism impact of Gatwick Airport, as we all know, is not to bring people in, but to take people out. And what we're doing is the people we bring in benefit the London economy. The people who leave could have gone on holiday in places around the UK. Blackpool is the poorest local authority area in the UK. So by taking more people out of the UK on holiday, what we're doing is we're increasing the inequality because we're pumping more money into London and we're taking money away from our seaside resorts around the UK. So rather than levelling up, Gatwick expansion plans will effectively increase inequality. Passenger numbers. So simply put, this isn't just making use of an extra bit of runway. This is Gatwick wanting to be as big in the future as Heathrow is today. And if you want to talk to anyone about that, just say that. That's how big it is their expansion plans. From this little tweak, from making one runway into two, or as they might call it, a dual runway operation within one airspace. We know what Gatwick looks like now. But this is the most curious bit of their plans. North and South Terminal here. They want to build a huge 10,000 square metre extra pier alongside. You could almost call this a Western Terminal. It's 10,000 square metres. That's a hectare in size. Absolutely massive. And they've got this transit system to link to it. Now, they don't talk about that in their plans. So I think, okay, well, is that the extent of it? Well, no. As well as having this extra runway, what they want in this planning application is to safeguard the land to the south still for what they would call a second runway. Now, if we go back to what they proposed to the Airports Commission back down in 2014-15. At that stage, we had the existing runway and a new runway to the south, and an absolutely massive terminal between the two. And their aim was to keep building this as the demand goes up. What they've got a planning application now is to put a pair of runways here. Well, what if they still had this in the back of their mind? What if they were still safeguarding this bit to the south, which they are? They could then have 2 dual runways. If one dual runway can make Gatwick as big as Heathrow is today, then that, as an ultimate goal, which they allude to by wanting to continue to safeguard the land to the south, would make Gatwick into the hub airport for London, displacing Heathrow's primacy, and then becoming the largest single carbon emitter in the UK, if you include the flights. Obviously, Drax is the biggest on the ground, but with the flights, it would make it absolutely huge. So, and that's what capitalism is. It's one airport competing with the other to be the biggest and the best without any constraints from government or any policy constraints to stop Gatwick doing what it wants to do. So I think that's its ultimate ambition. And this would be the first step on the way of the plan. As Sally said, an extra runway through the back door, but they still want their chance to make something absolutely humongous in the future. Well, we've analysed that, and we reckon that their existing plans for the new pier and the north and south terminal improvements don't get them anywhere near what they need for their 80 million passengers. So it looks like what they're trying to do is float this idea, and then at some point, I imagine during the construction process in the next 10 years, they'll want to then put something in, an extra runway to the south, to actually achieve their 80 million passengers at the time when people want to fly. What they're saying is they can get 80 million passengers by having people flying at all funny times of the day, extending the period each day when people fly. So they don't need any more terminal space because people are just arriving and going at different times. Well, that's frankly not the game. I think what they're trying to do is get permission now for the amount of noise, the amount of carbon emissions, the amount of surface transport emissions, the amount of air pollution that this scheme would generate with 80 million passengers. And then I think they want to, as Sally has very rightly put, take this backdoor application and then reveal to the world what their real plans are. And I don't think it's what they put on the table so far. So huge impacts, 70% more passengers, 35% more planes, more planes, more flights, more noise, CO2 emissions up by 50%. What that means is that the emissions from the planes, together with the surface transport and their ground operations, would total over 5% of what the UK's carbon budget is for 2038. Why 2038? That's an interesting date for 2 reasons. Firstly, is when they're going to build by. And secondly, that's the time when the UK is committed to include international aviation within its carbon targets. Now, if Gatwick's the 20th, Heathrow's bigger, then you can see that aviation's emissions are significant. And that's based on the UK's methodology for calculating the impact of flights. If you consider the impact of contrails, the water vapours, greenhouse gas multiplying effect at altitude, then you could be looking at 2 or 3 times that number. Road widening and rail congestion. So on the one hand, they're widening the road, which will suck in more traffic, but they're not making any improvements to the local roads. So that means that the congestion on the local roads would be magnified because you've increased the capacity of the big roads around the airport. And then at the very same time, they've said the passengers are going to go people on the trains. And what that means is that the idea of anyone else using the Gatwick main line is going to be pretty much starved out of possibilities because you're going to be standing room only at many times of the day based on purely people travelling on the Gatwick on the Brighton main line to Gatwick. I guess they'd like to call it the Gatwick main line. Wider impacts on nature and biodiversity. Really hard to see what that is at the moment, because if you look at that grand plan, which this sort of backdoor application doesn't really cover, the total scale of impact of the terminal and all of the externals that really would be needed to support 80 million passengers aren't in this planning application. So just like Heathrow, does an extra terminal, then does an extra runway, then does an extra terminal, then does an extra runway. I think Gatwick are playing the same game. So here's the runway plan. Right, well, as soon as that's approved, I bet you bottom dollar there'll be a terminal plan, And I bet you after that there'll be a plan for the other runway will come in, so that they'll keep flipping one to the other. So nature and biodiversity, there are impacts on bats, there are impacts on other species, but they're very much glossed over in this application. So carbon emissions, well, they say it's not significant. That's because they only count this blue bit as the bit they're responsible for. They ignore the red bit, which is travelling to and from the airport in the UK, and they ignore the green bit, which is the flights. And it's the overall together which we really need to consider. Gatwick therefore say, because they only consider this little blue bit, they say it's not significant. Well, clearly that isn't, but this is, and that is definitely more significant than that. In fact, you know, that's where we are at the moment. London Heathrow is the largest carbon emitter in the UK, and in terms of airports, it's the second largest in the world. So Gatwick are claiming that making their airport as big as Heathrow, which is the second biggest carbon emitter on the planet for aviation, won't be significant on climate grounds. Well, there's a promise, isn't it? Now, I think that's summed up on the next slide, really. I just imagine a couple of Conservative politicians sitting in a pub and trying to think what rhymes with net zero that we can use to apply to the aviation industry. And, you know, it sounds like greenwash, doesn't it? Well, if it sounds bad, it probably is. This is a group called Safe Landing, and they specialise in talking the truth, and they've done some challenges to this Jet Zero policy. I mean, it goes something like this. You may have seen in the news about this one flight, or before we get onto this, you know, flying without emissions, how hydrogen is greening aviation. This was from Davos. But the things you might want to spot is it's only focusing on a 20-seater plane, and it talks about the company's mission to create this in the future. BP, incidentally, note this: aviation is one of the hardest industries to reduce carbon emissions because it's only for the smallest aircraft you can use hydrogen, and therefore we really need to focus on liquid fuels. So that's what BP is saying. So, okay, there was one flight of sustainable aviation fuel last November, but that day, I looked at the data, that day there was 100,000 flights that day. So they've claimed they've made a transition because 1 in 100,000 has done things differently. But the problem is scale. The problem is scale. There isn't enough land to grow the fuel for these planes without taking that land away from either conservation areas or food growing areas. That's the reality. And so the amount of water used, the amount of energy used, you need to take something away to make space for this. So all it is a mirage to support the oil industry's continuing desire to supply fuel to burn in the sky. As long as sustainable aviation fuel is more expensive than kerosene, and as long as there's no government subsidy to use it, then airlines, who are a cheap business, do what they can at lowest cost, will not do it. So at the moment, what the airlines are doing is lobbying the government to pay to get the extra costs for the investigation. So, you know, you have to wonder who's behind this sustainable aviation fuel. And then greenwashing. I've put this slide in because this really annoyed me. Myself and Sally and other members of this growing campaign have been encouraged to call out this, which is some clever advertising around London underground stations, because Luton Airport has said we can grow, but they're going to have some conditions on their planning application to say if we create too much noise or we create a little bit too much traffic, all the carbon emissions, PS, only in our buildings and perhaps even our surface transport, but not the overall ones. So again, that minuscule bit rather than the whole lot. If they exceed their amount, then we'll stop the planes in their tracks. So you're going to stop the environmental, if we miss our environmental limits, which include the emissions from the planes, no, if we miss our environmental limits for what's produced in our buildings, then we'll stop the planes. But we'll ignore the carbon emissions in the planes. And the irony we've got at Gatwick is this green controlled growth approach, Gatwick haven't bothered with. So what's happened? The councils have stepped in and they're arguing that Gatwick needs to be as green as Luton. That's basically their gambit. They're saying you can't build that highway widening plan until you've got the modal shift. So let's put a thing to make sure you actually, but the problem is, once you've built the widened highway and you've got unconstrained car parking, surely people are going to flip back to using the car because the trains are more expensive. Absolutely crazy. You know, you could, so in theory, they'll say, how much can noise increase? Okay, well, they say each plane's slightly quieter so you can have more planes flying over because each one overall wakes you up less often, or something like that. Either way, I'm confused. And then carbon, you do the same, but you predict into the future and say, well, this is the number which we can allow it to increase based on this mythical jet zero policy from government. Well, we don't need green constrained growth. We just need to stop the growth of Gatwick. And then we've constrained the impacts of Gatwick. So I think we just simply say, just don't expand. And then there's the jobs thing. This is a really silly graph. I don't know if because you might not be able to see the line here, so I'm going to use my finger. So this is what happens in the recession, 27 to 2020. Flights went down, then they went back up again. What happens with jobs is they went down and they didn't go back up. So what's happening to aviation is we're getting more flights for the same number of jobs at the airport. This incidentally is work done by the New Economics Foundation, which GACC have employed to basically analyse the economic case done by Gatwick Airport. Because alongside Sally and her excellent team's work on the impacts, we also need to challenge their stupid claims side of the argument. So it's loops. So we know about noise and night flights. 40% more road traffic. I thought I should put this slide in. It is possible for airlines to subsidise rail travel because they have done in the past. EasyJet used to give 20% discount on Gatwick Express, and the first ever commercial service from Gatwick to Paris included a first-class rail ticket from Victoria in the price. So that's where we started at Gatwick. So we could do that again. There's absolutely no reason why that couldn't be part of the story. But I think the biggest challenge, though, is we've just got to stop it happening. Air quality. Let's skip over that. Water and flooding. Did you know that the historic village just to the south of Gatwick Airport was called Lowfield? Does that not just say it all to you? But Gatwick, ably challenged by Sally's QC, have tried to argue that in terms of the flooding impact, they've got two projects. They've got a highway project and they've got a runway project. And they can take the highway's 100-year return period for flood risk for the highways project, but presumably because they want to build this second runway that they're not yet talking about yet through the back door, they're saying this runway is only going to last for 40 years, so we can underplay the climate impact of the flooding. And that links directly to the sewage impact, because the sewage collection from Gatwick Airport is pumped through 8 pumping stations to Crawley and 8 pumping stations to Hawley. The Hawley one goes through a 300mm diameter pipe. It's absolutely massive. And Gatwick's modelling said in the future, with all these extra toilets, it's fine on a dry day, but on a rainy day, our sewage will overflow Hawley sewage works. Well, why do people go to the toilet more on rainy days? That's what I want to know. Well, what actually happens is Gatwick have put a lot of the surface water drainage, which runs off their runways, straight into their sewage system. And they're not proposing to address that currently in this application. So what they want to do is nick water from the water scarce area to the south of the airport, which will damage the Arran and Triple SI nature areas. And then they want to be able to have that together with all of the rain that happens on a rainy day, dump it in the River Mole and flood Leatherhead and everywhere downstream. It's clearly the not sustainable approach for water. What they should be doing is putting proper water conservation measures in place. And what we think they should be doing is doing all of those things, regardless of whether the airport expands or not. It's a good opportunity now to argue for the better control of what we have now. Nature, I said, well, the landscape impacts haven't really been looked at, but but that's a challenge. So I just want to talk briefly now, towards the end, about the process, because it's a horrific process. It's like a planning application, but it's like an Uber planning application. First of all, you have to register to have a say. So many of you, I think, might have registered. The deadline for that was back in November. Now they've got a 6-month process, 6-month timeline, where there's an examination in public of this planning application. So different groups like CAGNY and GACC, councils and many individuals, nearly 5,000, the most ever for this type of application from the government, have 6 months to basically play ping pong, mainly in writing, but occasionally we get an opportunity to go and have our say and raise questions at a hotel down in Crawley. And at the end of August, that process ends, and then the Government Planning Inspectorate, PINS, have got 3 months within which they've got to tell the government what their recommendation is, which my understanding is that will take us to the end of November. People are talking about general election middle of November at the moment, but I guess it could be any time up until the 4th of January. The Secretary of State then has 3 months to decide, in theory, but in practice, sometimes they've taken longer on these sort of processes in the past. So you can see that there's this bit, which a few of us are engaged with now, but then there's a question of what do the MPs think? What do the councils think? What do the politicians think? What's the view of the new government? Does the new government think that the aviation policy of the UK that's making better use of existing runways should be written up and started again? Does the new government, for example, think that the Jet Zero policy isn't worth the paper it's written on? In fact, there's 2 outstanding legal challenges on that. And might there be a collection of different parties potentially elected around Gatwick Airport? I think there is a potential, certainly for the Lib Dems fighting hard in some Surrey seats, and Crawley may well change hands. So that might be the 3 major parties all could have political representation around the airport. So, and they could all make the case that the Secretary of State should not make the decision themselves, but actually put it to Parliament for a vote and really encourage their parties to take a stronger position on airports expansion, on climate change during the general election, and then in the government of whatever mix-up that follows. And then, as Sally's already mentioned, there's the potential for legal challenges. So I would say, please do get involved. There's plenty of local groups and opportunities to have your say, both directly in the process and trying to influence the planning inspectorate. But also, I think what we need to do is raise the profile of this issue, so the enormity of the scale of the impact it's likely to have on the local area is truly understood. And do any of you remember Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Yeah. So I remember one of the opening episodes of that TV programme. He was lying in front of a JCB and said, "Don't dig this up." And someone said, and the guy came along and said, "Didn't you see the planning application?" Said, "Well, where was it posted?" "Well, in the planning office." "Well, whereabouts?" "Well, if you went into the office and then through the trapdoor and then downstairs and through the crowded basement, and then you found the hidden disabled toilet, it was posted underneath the lid of the toilet." But it's too late now. So the opportunity now, there's no point waiting until it's too late. We need to have a say now while this process is going on. But be aware that once this process ends, the planning process, this is a bit like, at the end of it, a planning officer in the local council recommending to the planning committee something should go for approval or refusal. That's what we're playing for at the moment. After that, you've still got the planning committee who get to say whether that planning application should go ahead or not. And the most crucial ones tend to be debated by councillors locally. Well, the equivalent of this nationally is the government should debate it. The MPs should behave like the councillors, and they could accept or overturn whatever the planning inspectorate say. So we have an opportunity all the way through, and that's all I was going to say. So thank you.